Max, for calling in. Let's go to Hassan on the line from Slough. Welcome, Hassan.
Hi, assalamu alaikum. A few points to make. I will come to the solution. The first thing is, let's hope that the ceasefire is not a chance for both sides to rearm, that it should be a permanent peace. Secondly, all of us would have been affected by the pictures of children, children's dead bodies, or also one toddler with shrapnel wounds on his face. And any human being would be affected by that. It was quite interesting that some people tend to compare death tolls on both sides. The Palestinian side had a higher death rate. Well, the reason is that Israel actually protected its civilians. What did Hamas do to protect its civilians? Absolutely nothing. Regardless of the millions of dollars of funding they get every month, they just purchase missiles. That comes to the third point, which is this. I've been fairly disturbed, actually, with the lack of condemnation by our fellow Muslim brothers and Palestinians on Hamas. We'll all be aligned on the fact that, yes, Israel had, there were casualties. Civilians had died, over 200. The world has condemned Israel for that. But where is the condemnation of Hamas, where they actually launched missiles, targeted civilians? If it hadn't been for the Iron Dome, the casualties would have been much higher, the civilian casualties. And you and I know, both from Islamic principles, there are strict rules of warfare. You cannot target civilians. So Hamas has not been condemned. I really do not understand that.
Are you saying from within the Muslim community it needs to be condemned more?
Yes, Muslims and Palestinians. I mean, we'll all be aligned in condemning Israel for certain actions. There's no disagreement there. But I've been surprised with the lack of condemnation.
Does that surprise you, Hassan? You've been saying, I know you're saying it should happen, but is it surprising to you?
Well, it is because we are Muslims. Again, I've watched the Muslim scholars, the preachers here in the UK.
But look how far radicalisation has already gone.
Yeah, and where is Islam then?
So the reason I'm asking whether it surprises you or not is because actually, unfortunately, we're in a situation where I fear things are about to boil over a tipping point from which it's difficult to return. Having witnessed these attacks across cities across the world and inside Israel, it's where, for me, I was like, how do you put the emergency brakes on this now? How do we? Now, one thing is, of course, changes of attitudes within introspection within communities, which is what you're addressing, yeah? But what about, politically? Like, what about what I mentioned about the need for all regional players to be involved? How do we make sure this doesn't happen again?
Yeah, and that will become, that's my sort of final point, which is the regional solution. But before I get into that, there has to be, we need to have some introspection because, we talk about Islam, we talk about being Muslims, and yet we jettison our religious principles when it comes to killing innocent civilians and not condemning Hamas. Yes, there's been anti-Semitism, again, as an example of us jettisoning, or some of us jettisoning our religious principles where racism is not allowed. Equally, Jewish extremists in Israel had chanted, kill the Arabs. That goes against Judaism as well. So to answer your point, and here's my final point about the regional solution, the solution was actually in process when some Muslim countries recognized the state of Israel. And you'll recall when the United Arab Emirates recognized Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu immediately suspended his planned annexation of a part of the West Bank. So as more Muslim countries recognize the state of Israel, Hamas, more importantly, must recognize the state of Israel. Peace will break out.
So, Hassan, in my introduction, did you catch where I said that outside-in approach is not what I refer to as the regional approach because it excluded a key player in the region, or players, and that was Iran and Iran's friend or ally Assad in Syria, and the Golan Heights, of course, is part of the dispute between Syria and Israel. Iran, of course, we know funds both Islamic Jihad via Assad in Damascus and also directly to Hamas, and of course Hezbollah sitting in Lebanon to Israel's north. So if you have an outside-in approach, which is what you're referencing with the Abraham Accords, it's not fully regional unless it somehow Biden has to include, even if Israel doesn't want to talk to Iran, understandably, somehow Biden has to include these other players to properly fix a regional solution.
Yes, and Iran could be included in this. Iran should also recognize the state of Israel. Why shouldn't it? I mean, everyone's a player here, regionally and outside. So Iran should stop supplying Hamas with missiles.
So what do you do if you're Assad, right? And you say, right, Assad, recognize Israel. Says, okay, give me the Golan Heights back. That's mine. Well, I mean, you know my views on Assad, by the way, just to make that very clear, right?
Well, it is possible. I mean, there have been previous terrorist organizations that no longer, believe in terrorism. And let's not forget, I think it was Yitzhak Rabin, the ex-Prime Minister of Israel, the late Prime Minister, who actually gave some land back to Syria. I think it was part of the Golan.
That's why I'm saying this recognition point has to be recognised that those states that don't recognise Israel also need something. So that's part of the negotiation. As immoral as it feels, right? If the moral outcome of a negotiation with your enemy is peace, then that's why it's worth it. People accuse Mandela, of course, when he started speaking to the South African regime. What it led to is what the aim was, not the fact that you're speaking to your enemy and your enemy believes in white supremacy, which is what Mandela had to deal with. So, sometimes you have to have very difficult conversations. And I'd suggest that, of course, Syria doesn't recognise Israel, and Assad would say, and despite what I think of the tyrant, Assad would say, well, you've got my Golan Heights. So, but thanks, Hassan, for calling. I'm going to try and quickly squeeze Barbara in from Leicestershire before we go.